Oh, wait, this is like back here. So I need a pillow. Ready to go? Welcome, everybody. So glad to see everyone here today for this program on perspectives on domestic violent extremism. My name is Claire Finkelstein, and I'm the faculty director of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, or CERL. CERL is a nonpartisan interdisciplinary institute dedicated to preserving and promoting the rule of law in 21st century national security, warfare, and democratic governance. CERL draws from the study of law, philosophy, and ethics to answer the difficult questions that arise in times of war and contemporary transnational conflicts. CERL is affiliated with the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. This program today is part of a several-day event to study the phenomenon of domestic violent extremism among a group of experts in national security, law, and other disciplines, spanning the range from theoreticians in academia to people with long experience in law enforcement and other practical professions. We're very grateful to have this interdisciplinary mix of experts to address this extremely difficult question. And we hope to be, that it will contribute to ongoing work that we can present in a public forum. We expect to have a volume of papers come out of it in our series in Oxford University Press, in the series in ethics, national security, and the rule of law, as well as white papers and other products to help advance the discussion. Before I introduce our moderator today, I'd like to invite the chair of the CERL board, Mort Halpern, to come say a few words. Thank you, Mort.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to add my welcome to you all here. We're discussing one of the critical issues that a democratic government faces, which is how to protect its citizens from violence and other unlawful acts, while at the same time protecting their individual rights and individual liberties. And that requires taking both seriously and finding solutions which are consistent with our constitutional values and enable our government to protect us from violent threats. So I look forward to an interesting discussion and glad you're all with us.
So the topic that we're going to talk about today is absolutely a critical one, and there is no better moderator than I can think of for this than my dear friend and colleague here on the CERL board, Shawn Turner. Shawn is a professor of national security communication at Michigan State University and an on-air national security analyst for CNN. He recently completed a year-long special assignment serving as a senior advisor to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. His previous government positions include serving as the Director of Communication for National Intelligence at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, as Deputy White House Press Secretary for National Security, and as Deputy Press Secretary for Foreign Affairs for the National Security Council. Earlier in his career, Shawn served for 21 years in the United States Marine Corps. Shawn's research interests are at the intersection of mis and dis and malinformation and national security. And just before I turn it over to Shawn and to our august panelists, I want to express my deepest gratitude first to the Annenberg Public Policy Center and the Annenberg Public Policy Center staff for their incredible support for our endeavors, and this one in particular, and to the CERL staff for doing such a fantastic job putting this all together. And finally, to the Perry World House, who is also a co-sponsor and a partner for this event. So thanks to our partners, thanks to Shawn and to our panelists, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Claire, and thanks to the entire CERL team for the great work in putting together this conference. What I'm going to do is introduce our esteemed panel here, and then we're going to dive into the discussion. And I want you all to be thinking about your questions because this is such an important topic, and it's important that we not only sit up here and talk about it, but that we hear from you. So to start out, I want to introduce Mr. Robert Kellner. Robert is a partner at Covington and Burling LLP in Washington, D.C., where he chairs the firm's election and political law practice group. He counsels clients on a wide range of political law and government ethics matters and defends them in civil and criminal court. He also leads the firm's prominent congressional investigations practice. Robert is a leading authority on the Foreign Agents Registration Act, as well as the federal and state campaign finance and lobbying disclosure laws. So Robert, thank you for being here. Professor Mary McLeod is executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection and a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. Professor McCord was the acting assistant attorney general for national security at the U.S. Department of Justice from 2016 to 2017, and the principal deputy assistant attorney general for national security from 2014 to 2016. Previously, Professor McCord was an assistant U.S. attorney for nearly 20 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. And finally, I want to introduce Mr. Oren Segal from the Anti-Defamation League. As vice president of the Center on Extremism, Oren Segal and his team combat extremism, terrorism, and all forms of hate in the real world and online. Recognized as the foremost authority on extremism, the center provides resources, expertise, and training which enables law enforcement, public officials, and internet and technology companies to identify and counter emerging threats. Oren joined ADL in 1998 after working for the New York Times and the Jewish Community Federation in San Francisco. Much of his 21 years with the ADL has been devoted to evaluating the activity and tactics of extremist groups and movements from across the ideological spectrum, training law enforcement officers, and publishing reports and articles on a wide range of extremist topics. So a round of applause for our panel. Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and dive in here. I'm going to start off the conversation by providing some context. I think if we are going to discuss domestic violent extremism, it's important that we start by talking about the broader context in which we're having that discussion. So I want to spend a few minutes at the outset examining what some recent polling suggests about how divided we are, and look at some academic research that gives us a sense of what's happening in the space and why we may be where we are. Now, at the outset, I want to say that not everyone agrees with regard to this idea that we are a divided nation. So I want to put that up front. There are a number of longstanding indices that suggest that as a nation, we are more cynical, more pessimistic than we've ever been before. And so some would suggest that when we answer questions about how divided we are as a nation, that what we're really seeing reflected in some of that polling may simply be the result of the idea that we feel pessimistic about where we are in this country, as opposed to a result of actually looking at the issue and analyzing it. So that's something that we can discuss on the panel, but I just want to put that out there because as I said, not everyone agrees. But I think we can all agree that it is the case that there's a lot of data that suggests that we are divided as a nation. And so what I want to do is spend a little bit of time focusing on a couple of those data points and talking a little bit about the research. And then we're going to dive in and talk about some of the causal factors of this issue. So I tend to look a lot at polling as part of my research, and I look at polls of polls and see what the trends are over time. Some of the research I did in preparation for this discussion shows that, I see a recent poll of polls, more than 85% of registered voters describe Americans as being greatly divided in their values, while only 15% say that democracy in the United States is going well or extremely well. Comment on elections. A series of recent polls found that 43% of voters feel confident or very confident in the integrity of our election system, while 56% said that they have little or no confidence that elections represent the will of the people. And when we look at polling that examines how we feel about the future, we see that more than half of Americans, 53%, expect political divisions to worsen over the next few years, as opposed to get better. And here's one that I watch very closely, and the one that I think is most startling. The University of Chicago's Institute for Politics found that more than a quarter of voters, 28%, report that they believe that it will be necessary for Americans to take up arms against the government in the next couple of years. So I think that whether we're talking about gun legislation, racial equity, abortion, COVID, immigration, LGBTQ issues, whatever it may be, we tend to disagree on these issues. And we can debate the degree to which our disagreements are at the core of the issue of domestic violent extremism. So as we talk about those polls, I want to shift here for a minute and talk a little bit about what research tells us in this space. There's a growing body of research that suggests that when it comes to our ideological differences, we are increasingly shifting from a state where we have the ability and willingness to cognitively think about and cognitively process our differences. Studies show that many in our society increasingly live in a state of mind that researchers refer to as ideological contempt. And the idea behind ideological contempt is that when you encounter someone who thinks differently, believes differently, relates differently than you do, you deem that person worthy of contempt without ever really understanding the context or the substance of the differences that you share. Not only do you deem that person worthy of contempt, but in far too many cases, we deem those people worthy, or we deem those people a threat to our way of life, to our in-group, to our democracy. And so if we think about what that really means, the idea that I don't just disagree with you, I think that you're a threat. I think that's worthy of part of our discussion today with regards to the way we see each other. I just want to touch on one other bit of research that relates to some work we're doing at Michigan State University. When it comes to the issue of mis, dis, and malinformation, you know, we're going to talk today about some of the causal factors with regard to domestic violent extremism, and we all know that mis, dis, and malinformation is at least part of the equation. There's a growing body of research that suggests that even in cases where the source of disinformation and malinformation says to those who have embraced the misinformation or malinformation, when the source says it's not true, I made it up, even in those cases, we are resistant to rejecting that information. The research suggests that what we do is we make up excuses for why the source is pulling back on that information. Things along the lines of, they say things that they reported in our research, things like they got to them, and they have to say that or they'll get in trouble. They will do anything to tie themselves in knots to cling to that disinformation or that malinformation. So it really sort of paints a picture of how daunting the challenge is with regard to mis, dis, and malinformation. And as we get into this discussion, we're going to talk about that issue as well as some of the other factors and what we need to do to address them. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the discussion, and I'm going to start with Oren. We've sort of painted a picture of where we are in the nation and sort of how we are dealing with each other as a society. But when we get specifically to the issue of domestic violent extremism, can you help us understand a little bit about the numbers, the data? What does the data tell us about how serious the rise in domestic violent extremism is right now?
Yeah, sure. So I'm your motivational speaker, hopefully. So the reality is that the numbers on domestic violent extremist activity have been actually quite consistent for 10 years, in the sense that when you look at the past 10 years, at extremist-related murders, for example, right-wing extremists, anti-government extremists, white supremacists, etc., have been responsible for 75%. This is over the last 10 years. So I think that a lot of the public discussion over the years, prior perhaps to 2016, focused on ISIS and Al-Qaeda. These are legitimate threats that we cannot ignore. We've seen the violence in the streets in our country. But we have seen domestic violent extremist activity for a long time. So I just want to sort of start there. This is not new. This is something we've been dealing with for many, many years. But we've also seen domestic extremist groups and movements and ideologies take off in different ways. Some of it we can measure because of what we're seeing on the ground. Some of it is the reality of what we're seeing online. So for example, when you look at something as simple as white supremacist propaganda, right? Efforts to place hateful ideas on pieces of paper, on government buildings, on religious institutions, on the quad on campus, in public spaces. We have literally seen an increase over the last 5 years because it's cheap and efficient, but also because it's an easy way to create fear and anxiety in communities. White supremacists, as one extremist movement in the country, want to be seen, they want to be felt, and they want to make people feel unsafe in their community. So the last year that we counted this, there were over 6,000 such incidents in the United States. If you look at hate crime numbers, this is from the FBI. Not all of them are extremist related, by the way, but it's another measure and a snapshot of hate in this country. We saw for 2020, the last time the FBI put out this data, a 7% increase from the year before, and a high that we hadn't seen, I think, since 2012. So hate crimes are increasing in this country. One of the things that ADL measures, again, as a snapshot, are anti-Semitic incidents around the country. We saw a 34% increase in 2021 from 2020. 18% of those we can connect back to actual extremist movements, extremist groups, et cetera. And so it's not a pretty picture. And we haven't even talked about the other numbers, millions of hours of video and audio content created by extremists every single year. Hundreds upon hundreds of social media platforms where the early adopters are 11-year-olds and the extremists themselves who want to make sure that they're the first to exploit the opportunities that new technology provides. And so access to hateful ideas, to ideas that incite violence is as easy today as it has ever been in human history.
Yeah. So thanks for that, Oren. And I think that with that sort of foundational understanding of what's happening in the country and what the numbers look like in the DVE space, Mary, I'd like to go to you. I think I want to organize the conversation today so that we talk about really three issues. I want to talk about the causal factors. I want to talk about the facilitators, those things that allow for DVE to spread. And then I want to close by talking a little bit about some of the solutions that we might put into place. So in one of our sessions this morning, Mary, we talked about the role that technology and specifically social media is playing and contributing to and exacerbating the rise in domestic violent extremism. The views on that issue range from, look, this is a slippery slope. This is a First Amendment issue, and we need to be careful here when we talk about whether or not we need to police the social media space. Range from the low end all the way up to absolutely, this is where the fuel is put on the fire, and we need to look at things like regulation and control content and those things. So can you talk a little bit about first, how pervasive or what is the role of social media in the online space in exacerbating DVE, and where are you on that spectrum with regards to how important it is?
Sure. Thank you, Shawn, and thank you to CERL and the Annenberg Center for hosting this really, I think, important conference. You know, we talked this morning about sort of what are the big things that have changed in domestic violent extremism. And I think the digital spaces, social media, as well as cable news, as well as the proliferation of videos, podcasts, et cetera, is what has really changed from, let's say, for example, the times of Al-Qaeda as a foreign terrorist organization, you know, preparing to launch various spectacular attacks, including 9/11, and even domestic extremist groups like the KKK, which sort of really had a renewed heyday in the late 70s, early 80s. But none of them had the benefit of social media, and they had to organize by meeting in person. There was heavy vetting of people, and it was just much, much harder to do. And now we saw in 2014, starting really in 2014, when ISIS declared a caliphate, we saw ISIS embrace the use of social media to recruit, to propagandize, to monetize, and to radicalize and to plot and plan. And that's what we're seeing with our domestic extremists. And we're seeing it cross-populating across different ideologies. And by that, I mean, we have white supremacists, like Oren mentioned. We have accelerationists, which are sort of an amped up white supremacist groups, which are trying to agitate faster and faster towards civil war so that they can create a white ethno-state. We have conspiracy theorists, QAnon and others in the online space. We have unlawful private militias who are anti-government in their ideology, but oftentimes their members also have real ties to white supremacy or just anti-other sentiment. And we're seeing all of these different ideologies, which may disagree about certain things, nevertheless coalesce around whatever the culture war movement of the day is, right? If we look to 2020, we had the pandemic and they all came together, driven usually by disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation to, physically then go out into the streets and protest things. Armed assaults on state capitals, for example, in opposition to governors' ordered public health orders, shutdown orders, mask mandates, what have you. We saw similar mobilizations by all of these groups, in response to racial justice protests after George Floyd was murdered. And then, of course, Stop the Steal was, driven in, not solely in the digital space, but the digital space amplified so much what was driving it elsewhere. We certainly had the former president driving some of that with his rhetoric about a rigged election, doubled down on at the time of the election. But this online space allows for almost instantaneous recruitment, radicalization, propaganda. So, and that has been also buffeted and supplemented by elected officials, politicians, people in positions of power with a veneer of credibility who are adopting the disinformation, spreading it, using it through their own social media, etc. So this, of course, has led to a lot of discussion about, and we were having these discussions when I was still in the Department of Justice, when ISIS declared a caliphate. I had lots of meetings myself with social media companies, has led to a lot of discussions about regulation. But that does, as you indicated, Shawn, it really bumps up against, in this country, we have very strongly held views about the First Amendment. It's one of our fundamental civil rights in this country. It's what makes us different from other authoritarian countries. I think many of us, even those of us who are strong, have strong views on national security and law enforcement, also believe strongly in the right to freedom of speech and freedom of association. And so when you start to talk about government regulation of private companies, then that raises First Amendment concerns, particularly when we're talking about content moderation. Now, until a recent Fifth Circuit decision, I would have said private companies are not subject to the First Amendment, and that still is true. We have one court that seems to be questioning that, but private companies, generally speaking, are not subject to the First Amendment. So private companies can on their own decide they want to moderate content based on viewpoint, and that is okay. When the government tells them they have to do it, that's when you have a First Amendment issue. And so, some of the things we've been talking about today at this conference and some of the things that I think are, part of possible solutions are there ways, first of all, to, encourage better moderation of their own platforms by the companies? Are there ways to do that short of direct regulation? Are there ways to get at the problem by regulating algorithms or requiring algorithm transparency? We know by empirical studies that consuming one type of content on a platform, the platform's algorithms just feed up more and more of that content. It's called a loop effect, and you really have to break yourself out of it to get out of it. So, there's potential regulation of algorithms, or at least transparency in algorithms. There's a potential for, a type of a notice to a platform, say somebody who's the subject a victim of doxing or trolling, notice to the platform, and the platform then would be triggered to have some sort of response, and otherwise it would not be protected against lawsuits like it currently is. So all of these things are, kind of on the table for discussion, but they're very controversial.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Mary. So Rob, I want to bring you into this. So everything that Mary just said, it sort of falls into two categories. On the one side, there are all these things that can happen in the virtual space. I think as Mary indicated, sometimes those things that happen in the virtual space manifest themselves and manifest in the physical world. But let's stop for a second. Let's put that aside. Imagine for a second that I've completely bought into the extremist ideology, let's say a nationalist ideology. I'm taking every opportunity to spread my hate-laced views at home, at work, online. Let's further assume that I express high praise for those who I call brave patriots who have taken up arms against all those who don't belong here in my country. And oh, by the way, I freely, openly, and frequently exercise my Second Amendment right to bear arms. But I have done absolutely nothing illegal. And I continue to say what I want to say when I want to say it about how I feel about this issue. Should there be any authority, any entity or authority or process or procedure in this country to do something about what I am doing?
You know, the distinction between thoughts and ideology on the one hand, Shawn, and actions is significant, both morally and under US law. The Supreme Court, in a whole range of different First Amendment cases, has sought to create a pretty wide berth to protect political speech, including political speech that is unpleasant, including political speech that might border on extremist or actually consist of extremist thoughts. Because we value so highly the ability to express political views. So we draw a sharp distinction between that and an actual conduct. There are cases dealing with incitement, which we've heard a lot about lately in connection with the January 6th investigation. But again, the case law around incitement requires a really high bar, a high evidentiary bar for actually commanding or requesting violent action, not just strong political language. And so as we concern ourselves with violent extremism, looking for ways to mitigate it, to manage it, we really as a society have to be careful that we don't lose our focus on First Amendment values, the value of free speech. There are different contexts, right? So there are people who are in the military who might be subject to one set of standards. There are people who are in law enforcement who might be subject to a different set of standards. And then there are civilians who are not government employees who themselves might be subject to a different set of standards. And the law does distinguish. The government has a bit more flexibility to restrict the speech or to sanction the speech of government employees, although even there is First Amendment protection, and the Supreme Court has said there's a balancing that has to take place between governmental interests and private speech interests, but certainly outside the context of government employees, there's a very high bar. And so for those people who have radical views, extremist views, but who do not act on them, who do not actually engage in legally cognizable incitement to violence, there is a high degree of protection that exists in the law and should, in my view.
Please.
Can I just respond? So I don't disagree with that, but I think what we need to sort of bridging the two comments here is, the public space for civilians to, be as hateful as they want to be is protected. On social media, billions of dollars are being made off of the users of those platforms. These are private companies. And I just don't think it's unreasonable for people to have an expectation that those companies, private companies, do more to try to curtail the speech that we know is the lifeblood of violent extremism on the ground, that we know animates it, right? So for me, I think, I see this every single day. An example of this, and I'll be super quick, is there are literally white supremacists and other extremists who are live streaming their on the ground activity through various platforms every day. Worst case scenario is a Christchurch shooter, a Buffalo shooter who is live streaming their attacks. But every day, people are harassing people on the ground based on who they are and live streaming it, making money and getting the support of companies who are also making money off of that. We should not feel weird or awkward about saying that is not acceptable. You need to do more to take it off. And it doesn't mess with freedom of speech because these are private companies.
Shawn, if I could just respond to that, and I think I agree with a lot of it. I represent a bunch of social media companies, I should say. It's important to keep in mind there's a big difference between government regulation of content moderation by social media companies, mandated approaches dictated by the United States government, versus what the social media companies themselves do at their own initiative and already are doing. And as I think all the panelists know, many social media companies spend huge sums of money, have literally thousands and thousands of workers focused on content moderation to address a whole range of issues, including violence, incitement to violence. So a lot of that is happening. It's happening on a massive scale. It's probably happening in ways far more sophisticated than what government regulators could manage to mandate or implement. And I would have very serious concerns about attempts by government agencies to fine tune the content or the content moderation in social media. We've drawn a lot of value from the internet. We hear mostly today about the downsides of the internet, but let's not forget the tremendous value to our society from the economic point of view, cultural point of view, from the internet. And I would really hesitate to let the government mess with that, which I don't think the US government would do well at all. The companies themselves are extremely focused on content moderation.
And Robert, if I could just one question here, do you believe that the degree to which those companies are policing themselves is sufficient for where we are and the issue that we're dealing with?
It's like any other public good, right? You can never have enough of it. I
The
think
answer is no.
there will always be a goal of working harder, doing better, being more precise, balancing the competing interests. More resources can always help. But the point is, we're not going to achieve some kind of content moderation nirvana where we're able to remove from the internet all those things that might provoke bad conduct, just as the US government wouldn't be able to accomplish that either. And fundamentally, we have to decide, do we want the government taking charge of content on the internet? Or do we want to leave that in the hands of, by the way, not just a handful of big companies, but the channels of communication are evolving so rapidly. There are so many social media platforms now in so many different contexts, whether it's pure social media that we've been accustomed to, or whether it's gaming fora that have social media aspects, a whole range of other new technologies that are emerging.
Right.
The notion that the US government could effectively manage all that, regulate all that, I think is probably just a fool's errand. What we do need to do is make sure that there is an environment in which social media companies themselves are equipped to moderate up to a point without compromising our freedoms, without compromising free speech.
Okay.
Can I
Mary, please.
one thing? So I think one thing that we just haven't addressed at all comes back to the financial incentive, and Oren raised it. I mean, part of the reason that social media companies haven't done more is they are protected against liability by a US law, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which basically insulates them from liability when people are harmed by things that are planned or encouraged or incited or done over their platforms. And that's because the law treats them as though they are not involved in the actual production of the content of that, and therefore absolves them from liability. You know, when we think of most consumer products, the maker of that consumer product is liable for the foreseeable harms and injuries that that product results in, whether it's a hairdryer or a baby crib or an automobile. Social media is a consumer product. It's consumed by millions of people, yet they're absolved pretty much from the harm that their products create. And so, I don't see a big appetite on Capitol Hill right now for removing that immunity. And there were good reasons, I think, originally, as the internet was just developing, to enact Section 230, which are well beyond the bounds of what we have time to talk about here tonight. But I think things would change quite dramatically if there was no immunity and there were a couple of big fat judgments against these companies. So I think we have to keep in mind that they are able to actually do what they do with very little risk, other than consumers on their own deciding we don't want to use your platform. And consumers are just very fickle about that. They want their social media and they will use it despite the harms that it creates.
So I want to shift us to something that you raised, Oren. You talked about different groups and the role that these various groups play in domestic violent extremism. I want to read something here and ask for those of you in the audience if you know what this is. So, a nonpartisan association of current and formerly serving military, police, and first responders who pledge to fulfill the oath all military and police take to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, you hear that and you might think, that sounds great. What's wrong with that? But I think my panelists know what that's from. That is the oath from the Oath Keepers website. And so as we talk about various groups that might be at the center of issues of the rise of and domestic violent extremism, I want to ask my panelists. A lot of these groups, look, they talk about democracy. They talk about protecting our democracy. They talk about patriotism. They talk about things that we find admirable. I spent 21 years in the Marine Corps, and I read what some of these groups say they stand for, and I think, wow, that's what I stand for. So how do we address this issue when we look at these groups that have sort of co-opted what it means to be a patriot and what it means to protect our democracy as they pull in military and veterans and law enforcement? How do we address this issue when that's the tactic that they use?
So, yeah, I mean, that sounded lovely. Now we can read the rest of what the Oath Keepers have on their website and what they stand for. And all of a sudden it doesn't sound so lovely, right? So talking about, conspiracy theories, a new world order's coming, government wants to take away your guns, government's creating concentration camps to send people that they fundamentally want to take away our rights, right? This is an organization that has been involved in standoffs with federal government, in Oregon and Nevada, has had people arrested on weapons charges, fundamentally delivering some of the conspiracies that we know have animated violence. So a lot of that, by the way, is available in their own propaganda. So I would just say, when we're going to make judgments about groups and understand what they believe, we have to read everything that they're saying. And by the way, even just their website, you don't have to read everything. In fact, try not to read everything. But you're right. A lot of these organizations, even white supremacist organizations, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic, misogynistic groups, are wrapping their agenda and their ideology in patriotic sounding narratives. I mean, that's a tactic, by the way, that elected officials use, people who are trying to sell us goods use. Like, that's a tried and true way of trying to attract people to buy your stuff or agree with you, is to try to use their patriotism. But we need to understand, we need to be critical thinkers. We need to teach our kids to be critical thinkers so that when that happens, they're able to identify the full picture of what these groups stand for. And frankly, all you got to do is scratch the surface on many of the extremist groups that are active in this country to see exactly what they stand for. So for me, it's not that hard, actually. It doesn't take an extremist expert to understand what these groups are about. It just takes reading and understanding everything that they're saying. And that is critical.
But
And-
what do you,
and-
what do you,
and
can
so
you,
I'll stop there.
can you paint these groups with a broad brush? When you look at the totality of what they do, everything that you just described, and Rob, I'd ask you to comment on this. Well, I mean, is everything that these groups that they do, that they engage in, is it all bad?
Well, I just want to be clear that, we should keep in perspective the scale of the groups that we're talking about. Oath Keepers in particular, is relatively speaking, in a country the size of ours, a tiny organization. It's very much in the news and heavily amplified because of its role in the January 6th insurrection. And of course, those who are guilty of crime should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, and that's happening as we speak. But it is a tiny group. There are many other tiny groups, and if you put them all together, we're still talking about the fringe of the fringe of the fringe of American society. And extremism, including violent extremism, there's a long history of it in the United States. We've had multiple phases of our history before the Civil War period itself, anarchist bombings during the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and on, the Ku Klux Klan, Tim McVeigh in Oklahoma City, right? So we've had many bouts with Ruby Ridge. I could go on and on, many bouts with violent extremism in this country. And I don't actually think we're seeing any dramatic uptick in it of late. The salience of the insurrection has us focused on that, but it is important to keep it in perspective so that we don't overreact. We don't take measures that are disproportionate to the threat, and that we calibrate the measures we're taking. There are lots of groups with hateful ideologies. Those include the Oath Keepers. There are groups on both sides of the ideological spectrum with hateful anti-American ideas, but we're going to have to keep that in perspective so that we calibrate our response and don't overreact.
Okay, Mary?
I just want to go back to the Oath Keepers for a minute, because we've talked about some of it. If you scratch a little bit below the surface, you start to see some of the sort of the anti-other sentiment that motivates them. But even right on their landing page, right after that oath, they make it clear that they're pledging to defend the US Constitution, but also declaring they will not obey unconstitutional orders, right? So who do you think that they are relying on to decide if it's unconstitutional? Pro tip here, it's not the courts, it's their own judgment about what's constitutional and what's not, right? And they think gun regulations of any type are unconstitutional, right? They think, our immigration policy is unconstitutional. So they are trying to make their own decisions about this. I totally agree with Rob. They have a very outsized profile in our, public discourse currently. That's partly because, the seditious conspiracy trial is now started in Washington, DC. It has started this week. And so it's getting, press every single day. We've all seen the videos of the Oath Keepers marching in a stack up the steps of the Capitol. But they've been doing some pretty pernicious things for some time. In 2018, they started Spartan training groups, advertising for pools of volunteers to serve as a local militia under the command of a, quote, patriotic governor who is loyal to the Constitution, or President Trump if he were to call them up. In 2020, they deployed to Virginia. This is right after Virginia, for the first time in decades, its state legislature, both houses, had gone into Democratic control, and there was a Democrat in the governor's office. That's no longer the case, but that was the case in early 2020. There was a panic among gun rights absolutists, Second Amendment absolutists, that the governor and the state legislature was coming to take their guns. They deployed to Virginia to train sheriffs to organize posses under the authority of the county sheriffs to resist the dangerous actions of the state legislature. So during the first impeachment proceedings, Stuart Rose, the leader of the Oath Keepers, tweeted out in response to a tweet by the former president about the potential for a civil war if he were to be actually removed in office, said, "We will answer the call, President Trump, and our favorite weapon is the AR-15. So this is an organization that has been promoting an insurrectionist view of not only the Second Amendment, but just the Constitution. for years now. And unfortunately, even though I agree with Rob, it's not a ton of people. I've gotten to actually know a former Oath Keeper quite well. He testified at the House Select Committee proceedings, Jason Van Tatenhove, and he and I have talked about how, Stuart is a lot about power. He's a lot about show. He will, but when it actually comes to who shows up at things, oftentimes the group is relatively small. Many people send him money, and he uses his propaganda to make money because they don't really want to get off of their sofa and actually go deploy, but they will send money to it. But he has this outsized impact because it gets spread across social media, and then you have dramatic things like standoffs in Bunkerville or the insurrection.
So I think that the reason this is so important is because we sort of see a spectrum here with regard to what we think these groups represent and how significant they are in domestic violent extremism. So that sort of takes me to my next question, where I want to push on this issue of how serious the issue is. This morning in some of our sessions, we talked about the fact that domestic violent extremism isn't unprecedented. I think you said, Oren, it's not new. But if we look throughout our history, a rise in domestic violent extremism has typically been a reaction to something. So my question to all of you is, if we believe that we are seeing an actual rise in violent extremism, what is it a reaction to? And if we don't believe that we're seeing an actual rise in violent extremism, are there other factors that are causing us to believe that there is a rise? Maybe it's the media, maybe it's forums like this. So what are these folks reacting to?
In my view, we have seen a rise in extremism, but not really a rise in violent extremism. So our society is more polarized than it's been at many other stages of our history. And my own view is that the culture wars, so-called, are a major explanation for that. This has been an incredibly turbulent time in our history. Culturally, there's been dramatic change in the country. And depending on your perspective, it's good change or it's bad change, but it's really quite dramatic social policy change across a whole range of issues over a quite short period of time. And it's not terribly surprising to me that that's leading to political polarization. Certainly the internet and social media play into that trend. Economic insecurity play into it, but my own view is that social change, the culture wars, have been a significant factor. And what that suggests to me is that if we're looking to solutions, if we're looking to take the temperature down in our society, that is going to involve everybody striving towards the middle and looking for social compromise, which is not easy for either side of the aisle. And let me be clear about it. It's not just an issue for Republicans or the right wing. It's an issue for both sides of the aisle. And it's challenging and difficult for both sides of the aisle to genuinely look for middle ground solutions on controversial social issues. I do think that's important to lowering the temperature in our society, which I think is ultimately the driver of extremism, and in very rare cases, extremely rare cases, in my view, violent extremism.
So when you look at some of the deadliest domestic extremist attacks in this country's history, you, of course, look at Oklahoma City bombing, which was #1, right? But then you have a whole series: Poway, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Charleston, so on. Those have all happened the last couple of years. I mean, that's a sign that something is not normal. And then the why, you have a whole bunch of efforts from different places. You mentioned some: conspiracy theories, disinformation, online narratives that are fundamentally aimed at undermining our democratic institutions. When you undermine our democratic institutions, that will lead to more acts of violence because people don't trust anybody to protect them. And who's undermining our democratic institutions? Whose agenda is it? Whose propaganda is based on creating that? but it's the Oath Keepers and the extremists that we are talking about, a whole range of groups, QAnon conspiracy theorists. And by the way, this is a global extremist movement. The idea that this is just here neglects the fact that we know people abroad are actually impacting the domestic extremist activity in this country. So that has also changed. That's part of the communication ability. So again, I know this is kind of chicken and the egg, but when you undermine our democratic institutions, when people are unable to detect the difference between fact and fiction, that's where extremists thrive, and extremists never miss an opportunity to exploit a crisis.
I think 2 points I also want to add to, I think, what's a really rich discussion already. One is, yes, we've had tumultuous times, but I think we also sometimes fail to recognize that there are legitimate grievances, right, of people in this country. There are also illegitimate grievances, in my opinion, but there are a couple types of extremists in my mind. There are the opportunists. That's like Stuart Rhodes. He's like, this is a great bandwagon I can get on. I can make money off of it. I can have power. I can have fame. I don't know if Stuart even believes the things he says. I really don't, but it's been a platform for him to really elevate his profile and to put money in his pocket, and he travels widely. Then you have the people, the vulnerable people who feel left out either because of financial reasons. Maybe they live in communities where the dominant, manufacturing or whatever is no longer available to them. Maybe they, feel like they've been left out of the educational system, what have you. These tend to be the people, and we saw this with recruitment to ISIS. We see this with recruitment by domestic extremist organizations. They are vulnerable to that idea of, I got to blame my grievance on somebody else. So it's going to be immigrants, or it's going to be the government, or it's going to be, name your enemy. And this organization allows me to do that, and it allows me to do that in brotherhood with other people who believe this. It allows me to be part of a mission that's bigger than myself. And so those are the people who in many ways are then attracted by the opportunists who are exploiting this vulnerability and these grievances. But there are real grievances there, and there are things that need to be addressed at a very systemic and societal level. And then the other point I want to make is violence is not just these shootings at Poway and Pittsburgh and Charleston. It's not just flying, airplanes into buildings, which is horrendous, because violence, what we're seeing now, which is what I think is different than what we have seen in the past, is we are seeing a much more decentralized, localized movement to use intimidation, threats, harassment, sometimes a shooting, but it doesn't have to be a shooting, to really infringe on other people's constitutional rights and impact this democratic process. So we're seeing, and it's concerted. It's a concerted strategy. So after January 6th, big national, spectacular insurrection, notwithstanding that 3,000 people, still pretty big. I think we're all pretty mortified about what we saw on television. There was universal condemnation that caused an immediate lull in activity, a lot of finger pointing, name calling, saying things were honeypots and anarchist threats. But the new strategy that emerged was a decentralized strategy. County over country. Take your county, take a few, then maybe your state. What we need is a decentralized Christian nationalist political platform. Those are verbatim words from extremist platform GAB from May of 2022. And so we're seeing that at that localized level. We're seeing extremists, threatening election workers, public health officials, school boards, teachers, county boards, sometimes to the point that they leave their offices. Election officials are leaving in droves, replacing them in some cases with election deniers or those whose views are incredibly anti-government, anti-immigrant, et cetera. Sometimes then aligning with militias who are anti-government, or even a new, not really new, but a movement that's been around a while, but it's getting new attention, the constitutional sheriffs movement. Right. This movement of law enforcement sheriffs who believe they are the highest law enforcement in the land, and they'll decide what the Constitution is.
So on that last point, I want to ask you all a question with regard to, let's sort of look under the hood a little bit with regard to these groups. And the question is, if I'm a truck driver and I get caught up in the extremist movement and I have no military or law enforcement background, How is that different than if I am an active duty military service member or a member of law enforcement? What's the difference in me being one versus the other in the extremist movement?
So I'll just start quickly. We did a report at ADL that looked at the membership list of the Oath Keepers. Over 38,000 people signed up for this membership list over a 9-year period. And, most of the people who signed up were not law enforcement, military, first responders, even though that is the target audience for recruitment for the Oath Keepers. But what we did find was what we believe are 373 current law enforcement officers who signed up for a membership list, meaning paid money to subscribe to the Oath Keepers membership list. Over 1,000 former law enforcement, 81 current elected officials or those running for office, and over 100 what we believe are current military personnel. Relatively small numbers in comparison to all the people serving in these positions, but these are extraordinarily sensitive positions. Their goal is to protect communities, whether it's law enforcement here, protect all Americans, and yet they are, paid apparent membership dues to an organization that is not about protecting all Americans. So it's not only eroding public trust, which is a huge concern, but can these people actually carry out the duties that they are tasked to do when they may be involved with a group that is anathema to those sensitive positions? And they have access to information that most people in most professions don't have. We ought to be concerned in our, whatever region you are in, whatever part of the country you're in, if people who are serving in these sensitive positions are potentially part of extremist movements. To me, that is like the least controversial thing I feel like I've said all year.
So anyone else want to comment on that? We're getting close on time, and I want to make sure that we leave time for questions. So Rob, if you want to comment on that.
Quick reaction to that. Of course it's concerning, but at the same time, we have to be careful, particularly with the military, that every association with an extremist group isn't immediately treated as a basis for expulsion from the military. We have to calibrate. This country had a searing experience in the first half of the 20th century with associations with disfavored groups, leading to sanctions against individuals. From the Red Scare in 1919 to the McCarthy era, the House Un-American Activities Committee. And I think what we took away from that is, again, this distinction between thoughts and conduct. And while we would want our military to be aware of extremist organizations, connections to particular officials, for it to be reviewed, for it to be looked at, I don't think we should jump to the conclusion that group affiliations should lead to immediate expulsion from police forces or from military forces. These should be individualized judgments based on all the facts and circumstances, and particularly based on actual conduct, as opposed to ideological orientations.
Okay. One of the things I should have said in asking the question, and I think we all agree on this, is that when it comes to military, veteran, and law enforcement involvement in violent extremism, in the big scheme of things, the numbers are exceedingly small. And I just want to be sure that as we talk about military and veterans, sometimes when we talk about January 6th, people believe there's a crisis of violent extremism in the military. And I don't know if any of you would agree with that, but it would seem as though the numbers don't support the idea that that there's a crisis there.
I think for active duty military, the numbers don't, as our report, and who knows what it really is, are relatively small. But the number of veterans that were, and I don't have these numbers off the top of my head anymore, that have been involved in January 6th is a substantially higher number. And I can just tell you from my own experience doing research and litigating against militias that, it really is an attractive thing for veterans. Sometimes veterans are people who are mission-oriented people, particularly those that deployed in combat zones. And they come back, and sometimes it's difficult. I mean, you were a veteran. I'm not, so I should not be talking for you. I'm just speaking based on those I've talked to. And sometimes they not only have grievances that they're looking for something to sort of, brotherhood with others, but then a militia gives them that opportunity to be back in a command and control situation, back out training with their firearms, incendiary devices, paramilitary techniques, feeling like they have a mission higher than themselves. And it might be an anti-government mission, or it might be a white supremacist mission, but it's a mission. And I think that there's a real opportunity here. And you and I talked a little bit about this, Shawn, because you were of your time at the VA, give these people a mission. We've got some missions around the country. We've got lots of things that could be done. And I think there's so many opportunities to channel this need to be a part of something into something more productive.
Just 20 seconds.
Sure.
I just want to say, there's an irony here, because I think military, law enforcement, first responders have a bullseye on them. One, they need to know that people are going to try to recruit them to bad, organizations. So it's not, it's a service for those who are, serving our country, to let them know that they are going to be targeted. People are looking to bring them in. And of course, the second part is that these same groups often attack them. Right. And so there's that irony.
Okay. So what I'm going to ask my panel to do as we get ready to take questions is I want to come back to you all at the end if we have time. And I'd like you to think about this. If you had the mandate and the resources to set about doing one thing that you think is the first and most important thing that we should do to address this issue, or to get at this issue, recognizing that we need to approach this from multiple angles, but you have the mandate and the resources to do one thing, what would that thing be? And we'll come back to that at the end here. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and take questions. And I think we have, do we have a microphone here in the room? So we have a microphone here in the room if you have a question for a member of the panel. And I think we have questions online as well. So yes, sir.
Thank you, Shawn, and thank you for your service to our country over many, many years.
Thank you.
Okay, the four of you depressed us over the last hour and a half. So, and this is playing into Shawn's final question to you. What role, let me start with the premise that the one universal experience most of us have is K-12 schooling. What role can education, private, public, education play in ameliorating some of these problems you've discussed? Thank you.
Look, I think the loss of civics education in this country has been incredibly damaging across the country. It's much less common today than it used to be to require civics education. I also think that where civics education exists, there's probably a certain amount of politicization of how it's conducted. So I'm a huge supporter of civics education K through 12. It should be happening really every year at every appropriate level of education from kindergarten through 12th grade. And why stop then? It should be a lifetime undertaking. But for those who are responsible for school curricula, I think this should be among their highest priorities. The challenge then is to handle it in a non-politicized way, which is very tricky in our current society. But I think there are a few things more important than that right now.
Yeah, I'll just add one note to that. Across the country, in school districts across the country, we saw this phenomenon where people believe that by allowing their children to see these school board meetings where you have people screaming at each other over books and masks and curriculum, that people believe that that was a valuable experience for children. And I would argue that that is not an appropriate venue for civics education and exercising your right to be heard in front of your legislators and elected officials.
And that's part of the issue, right? The model, there's not good models out there right now. I mean, even when we talk about Congress and some of the rhetoric and really hateful things coming out of Congress, it's, you end up teaching them out of books, but not based on let's go and, watch things that are actually happening in our government. And that's gotta change. And which is why I think there is a real place for civics education and emphasis on it, emphasizing, the pillars of what our democracy was built upon, there are three branches of government. Let's start there because half of the country or more can't even say what they are. But I'm with Claire Finkelstein. Like, it's got to go beyond K through 12. We need civics education for adults because the amount of misunderstandings about what the Constitution says, what, how our democracy was founded, what the Second Amendment means, what the First Amendment means, it's just, there's so much just false information out there. And that's what people end up firmly believing.
Yeah, so I would just agree and just say critical thinking skills, from an early age, ADL trains and is in schools, over 1.5 million kids over several years. And part of the lessons is how are you become a critical thinker, right? How do you identify issues? And more importantly, how do you not be a bystander, allyship? So when you see something, another student being treated in a certain way, what is your role? It's kind of a lesson from the Holocaust, right? So being an ally and being a critical thinker, I think, are things that we can teach. And I also agree, it doesn't stop at 12th grade.
Agreed. Next question.
So very understandably, we've talked a lot about extremism on the political right. And I'd like to hear each of your opinions on how big of a problem is political extremism from the left. Thank you so much.
I'm happy to start with that. Look, I think extremism exists in both political parties. I think the rise of socialism as a movement within the Democratic Party is a tremendous problem and challenge for the country. I think that the violence that racked the country in 2020, the violence that essentially took over the city of Portland in 2020 and beyond, were serious threats to the integrity of our democracy. And at the same time, I think one can't really underestimate the threat posed by the current Republican Party's avowed loss of faith in the electoral process. So we have, I think, phenomena taking place in both political parties that, while they can't necessarily be equated, are serious threats to the fabric of our society. So we've got to be able and willing to condemn violence in the streets, just as we are able and willing to condemn political officials who would challenge the results of an election that's been verified, time and time again in the courts and otherwise. We often hear people sort of criticizing whataboutism, but it is important to recognize that, we don't live in a world where all the problems exist in one political party or on one side of the political spectrum. And when I said before, we need to learn how to move towards the center, that both political parties have to be able to be introspective, recognize their vulnerabilities, recognize where they're going to need to compromise. If that doesn't happen on both sides of the aisle, we will never get to a lasting accommodation.
Right.
Sorry?
Asking where should the left compromise?
You want me to get controversial, don't you? Look, I don't want to be specific as to issues, but I think that there's been, I mentioned socialism for one thing. That might be a nice place to start. Socialism is really not an American concept. And there's a significant part of the Democratic Party that is focused on what's now called progressivism, but really amounts to socialism. I think there have been social policy changes advocated by the Democratic Party that have been very disruptive to our society. But I want to emphasize that nothing is more important than the rule of law. I'm a Republican, have been my whole life. I'm a never Trump Republican because rule of law is paramount. It's the sine qua non for any democratic society. So challenging the results of an election that was a valid election is an incredible threat, frankly, to the society, the survival of our democracy. So I see room for great change in both parties.
So it looks like you both want to weigh in on that. So I'm gonna hold off and ask you both to Go ahead, Mary.
Thanks. I just want to get us back to your question, which is violent extremism. And, we've been trying to distinguish between ideology and violence. I expanded violence to be more than just shootings and running an airplane into a building to include intimidation and harassment. But if we actually look at data, and Oren will have it in chapter and verse, if there is violence, intimidation, or threats, regardless of the ideology motivating it, whether it's far right extremism, far left extremism, straight up anarchy, Islamist extremism, that should be condemned. That's not democratic. That's not consistent with the rule of law. And, I will just say, personally, I've mentioned my organization sues militias. We've sued primarily right-wing militias. Guess what? We also sued a left-wing militia after Charlottesville because they were out there doing a similar thing as the right-wing militias because it was about their conduct, not their viewpoint. But I think that if we look at the conduct, there's no question that the actual injuries and harms, certainly deaths, but also other harms have come primarily from the right. And this is consistent with also what the FBI director, Christopher Wray, has testified to now multiple times before Congress, that the greatest threats to our homeland security from extremism are from domestically, ideologically motivated extremism, within that racially motivated and specifically white racially motivated extremism, and anti-government extremism, including militia extremism, are the greatest threats. And that's based on what we've seen in terms of the injuries.
Okay. Oren, you want to weigh in? And then if we have questions online, we'll take a question online.
Yeah. So I'll be quick. I mean, violence is not the sole domain of any one sort of political movement, extremist movement, et cetera. We see it across the ideological spectrum. And yet the data also reminds us that when it comes to violent threats, we are seeing it more on the right. That doesn't mean that there's not like nasty ass people on both sides, that people don't say extreme things. But in terms of violent extremism, we are seeing more of that on the right, and it's sort of documented. I will just say this, though. It would be great for people on the left to condemn people on the left who might be promoting those ideas, and people on the right to condemn people on the right for promoting those ideas or normalizing it. That way, if you're already talking to somebody who's like kind of ideologically aligned with you, you might actually have an impact in a way that you're not pointing the finger on the other side. So maybe I would love to see that regardless. People speaking to the people that they can have the most influence on and tell them to stop normalizing this violence. That would be kind of awesome.
Okay, great. So I know we have another question here in the room, but I want to ask Rob, one of the things we did not talk about much in our session is the media and rhetoric. And I want to ask if you could just say a few words on why you believe that we don't seem to talk about violent extremism on the left as much as we do on the right. So is that because, doesn't exist as much, or is that because it exists as much, but there are other reasons why we don't seem to talk about it as much?
Well, look, I mean, the most notable example was the extensive civil disorders that took place in major cities in 2020, but it came, in a complicated social context after the George Floyd murder, during a pandemic, right? So I think it was difficult to focus on and discuss, and it occurred during the Trump presidency when the law enforcement reaction to it was immediately framed in the context of the Trump presidency, right? So I think it was difficult for our society to really process what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say Joe Biden, as I recall at the time during the campaign in 2020, did speak out against violent rioters, which was important. And that's a good example of somebody, maybe taking on a bit of a political challenge in order to make a principled statement. So violence does occur on both sides of the aisle. It should be condemned forcefully by each political party. Joe Biden, gave us a good example, although it was probably also politically wise for him in the middle of an election year. I think that's some explanation for why the media doesn't particularly like to focus on this issue. The other thing is, look, we all recognize that our media has become itself incredibly polarized and politicized.
Indeed. Yeah.
There are so few media channels today that are even striving for objectivity. When I think about what the media environment was like when I was growing up, there was an aspiration to objectivity. That was the goal of every good journalist. I don't really think that's particularly the goal of most journalists today, driven by the economics of the journalism profession and the way the economics of the media have evolved. There are very, very few objective channels. There are very, very few channels within the media that even try to be objective today. We're all watching the channels that we care to watch.
Right.
And that's been a huge loss for our society. And I wish I had a solution for it, but I don't.
Okay. Oren, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, I don't think like many like white supremacists view themselves as Republicans. In fact, many of them like are against Republicans. And, you know, and I'm pretty sure Antifa doesn't view themselves as like card-carrying members of Democrats. So I think when we talk about like political left and right is often very different than sort of the extreme left and right. And I just want to clarify that.
Okay.
But the reason why the media doesn't talk about it in general is because, you know, left-wing extremists weren't responsible for an insurrection in this country. Left-wing extremists weren't responsible for mass shootings in El Paso and Pittsburgh and Buffalo and Charleston and so on and so forth. Like, that's a reason why. And because Tucker Carlson is busy promoting his own version of the Great Replacement.
Let's take a question from the audience. Chris?
Thank you. I'm showing my age, but throughout our discussions today, as well as part of our conference, I kept thinking about a period and a movement I grew up with, which was the 60s. And when we were talking about, for instance, some tactics that the violent extremists use, I said, yes, I remember those. We all used them. For instance, you take an ideal that everyone agreed with, which we used to derisively call liberal, and you start pushing it, and the process was called radicalizing your fellow students. So it's really interesting to sort of compare the two periods, the period now and the earlier period. I mean, the student movement, you know, the anti-war movement in Europe, it was much broader because they got worker support, but we didn't in the United States, you know, became more and more radical, was very anti-American, filled with hate of the United States. And there was a small group of people, and there was plenty of violence, but it was violence at demonstrations. Nothing the police after a year couldn't handle, but there were some splinter groups, like famously the Weathermen, and then the sort of odder groups like the Symbionese Liberationist group that do have certain parallels to groups today. So I was, throughout these discussions, I was thinking of the analogies and parallels, but I also wanted to bring this up for some sort of optimistic ending to our discussions, which is, you know, that part of the student movement died out. Partly ending the draft deflated the anti-war movement, but people grew up. Now, a lot of the violent extremists you're talking about are not 18-year-olds, they're not 20-year-olds. They're people who are already grown up. So maybe the process is going to be different. But, you know, if you think back to the 60s, this country went through a tremendous amount, or, you know, starting in the 50s with the civil rights movement, but then in the cities, in the 60s, the cities were in flames. The demonstrations were gargantuan. So the question is, well, I meant to be a comment about an optimistic ending, which is it changed, it died out. And, you know, I think with the exception of certain political aspects of the January 6th, I expect the other stuff to die out.
Yeah. We talk a lot about the pendulum swinging in one direction versus the other. And a lot of people do believe that this is a case in which the pendulum has swung hard in one direction, but it will, as Chris suggests, eventually swing back in the other direction. And then people say, no, the pendulum broke off and fell on the floor, and and there is no swinging. So other questions? Yes, Jules. Oh, I'm sorry. We have a question here. Elizabeth, sorry, Jules, we'll get to you next.
Well, I'm sorry to take good news out of the jaws of, or what will I say, bring bad news out of the jaws of good news here from Chris. I frankly think this is a difference, what do we say, in scope that becomes a difference in kind. And I think what the difference really is as to why this is not the 60s. And I'm about to ask you a question, Rob, so listen up, is this whole augmentation that social media has given us. It not only amplifies, it gives a mechanism to connect and recruit and to do the kinds of things that we've seen earlier on in the Islamic radicalization. Now, Rob, I'm distressed at your, I would say, somewhat happy view that the companies are doing all they can. Frances Haugen had quite a different view. Who is right, Frances or you?
Social media companies. You know, I think you're never going to achieve perfect moderation of content in social media, just as you're not going to achieve it in any other medium. The fundamental choice is who should be making those decisions. Do you want the government moderating content in the media, whether it's social media or traditional media, or do you want the private sector doing that? Who do you trust more to do that, right? Do you think the government is competent to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate content? Do you think they're able to do that across the rapidly evolving technological arena where we have different kinds of platforms coming out every couple of years and proliferating? I don't think they're competent to do it. I don't think we should want the government making those kinds of content determinations. So we're going to have to live with a world in which the private sector imperfectly is going to struggle with the challenges of content in social media, or we should, in my view.
Okay. Okay. So we're going to take one or two more questions, and then I'm going to come back to my panel and ask them to tell us what they'd like to do. And then I am going to end us on what I hope is an optimistic note for the future. So, Jules?
So I just wanted to see if you have the same reaction that I had. I was listening to NPR, and the program is the run-up to the midterms. And they sent a reporter to Arizona, and he sat in on a local county's Republican committee meeting. And the chairman of the Republican committee said that the United States is not a democracy, it's a republic. Okay. And the import of that to me, aside from the fact that she obviously wasn't using critical thinking, was striking. And I would like to get your reaction to that. The United States is not a democracy, it's a republic.
I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said it's a republic if you can keep it, but he meant a democratic republic, right? So I think this is part and parcel of this idea of state nullification, of self-determination about what the Constitution says and what it doesn't say and what it protects and what it doesn't protect. And, you know, we're seeing that in states right now, you know, passing different types of legislation that are, first of all, you know, if you even just, and I don't want to get us down the abortion, you know, line, but like states that actually knew what the Supreme Court had held was a constitutional right and nevertheless passed statutes that would criminalize something that was a constitutional right. Like that, you know, I get the idea of sort of nipping at the edges of things and deciding where the line are, but that was just states just in open defiance. Now, it's just so happened that they got enough Supreme Court justices to go their way. But when you think about it, to just pass a law that was so openly, you know, violating constitutional rights that had been decided by the Supreme Court, it's pretty exceptional. And so I think, that what you heard there is a piece of this entire anti-government, counties are supreme, states are supreme against the federal government. And it's very damaging to our entire democratic system and rule of law.
What Mary said.
Okay, any other questions from the audience? We're going to take one more question.
That's what we're coming to.
Okay, what one thing? Okay, so we've got just a few minutes. So why don't we go ahead and do that? We'll go down the line here and I'll ask each of you, you've got a mandate, you've got endless resources, and you can do one thing that you believe is important to getting at this issue of the rise in violent extremism. What is that one thing? And let's start on the end with Rob.
I've already answered the question, which is K through 12 civic education.
K through 12 civic education. Okay, very good. Thanks. Oren?
Legalize marijuana. Wait, sorry, hold on. What was it? What was
Wrong panel, Oren, wrong panel.
wrong panel?
I'll be
Sorry.
Is that part of civic education?
Yes, totally.
It's just, attention spans wane. All right, we're all back. So, I mean, I feel that there are a lot of people who want to help push back against hate and have no idea how to do it. They don't know where to begin. They're not in academia, right? These are people who don't necessarily have access to, other people who are fighting this fight. So I happen to work with incredible people. There's incredible people on this panel who are dedicated to fighting extremism and hate and pushing back. So if I had unlimited resources, I would find all those people who I know are out there who are hungry and trying to find a way to be involved in the fight against extremism and hate and support them to get them involved in this.
Very good. A coalition of the willing. Mary?
So I don't do favorites. My kids know this. I cannot decide. When you say one thing, I can't do that. It's impossible for me. So I have two things.
That's cheating.
So one is really very much, I think, to Oren's point. What we know is that it's very easy to be horrible in an anonymous way. And that's what the online environment allows. Now, we've seen people who are happy being horrible non-anonymously as well, but still, much of what we see online is anonymous. And we also know that when people sit down in focus groups, because there's a lot of researchers out there putting focus groups together, and they're putting, people, Republicans and Democrats, people with strong anti-immigrant views, people with strong socialist views in rooms, they walk out thinking, you're not so bad. We know from putting KKK members with the first Black person they've ever met in their life that the KKK member often is like, wow, you're the first Black person I ever met, and I like you. And so when you put people face to face, it's a lot harder to hate. It's a lot harder to be, what was your word, have ideological contempt. And so what is the way to scale that, right? What is the way to have more of those conversations so that you see the humanity in people as opposed to putting that label on them? Okay, I don't know how to do that, but that's one thing I would do. The other thing, we haven't really touched on this at all, and but I think it plays into our political violence. We have a serious gun problem in this country. There is no reason that anyone should have a semi-automatic assault rifle. They're for personal use. It's not effective for personal use. It is used to intimidate. It is used to coerce. It is used to make people feel, what message does it send when you are standing with an AR-15 to everyone else other than, I can kill you right now if I want to? That is intimidation, that is hate. Our permissive gun culture, our easy access to guns not only has fueled our acts of terrorism here in the United States, it's fueled them abroad. It's why foreign terrorists say you don't even need to come here and join ISIS, just go buy an AR-15 and go shoot up your town. And so until we get a handle on our gun culture, we're going to continue to have political violence.
I would fund all these ideas if I could. So I'm going to end this here on what I hope is an optimistic note. I'll just take a few seconds here. One of the things that I absolutely love doing, and I feel like it's a real honor, is to spend time in college classrooms with students. And what I always tell my students is that every generation comes along and does things to make the world better. And they create new things, they develop things, they advance society, they advance technology. But every generation also breaks things that the next generation has to fix. And I tell them that my generation, your generation, we broke a lot of things that they have to fix. And what's heartening about those conversations is that they're up to the challenge. And I know that every generation talks about the next generation and the shortcomings of the next generation. But I will tell you that this generation, this next generation, for all the time they spend online and seemingly disconnected, they see what's going on. And I think our responsibility, not only to them, but to our democracy, is to take them under our wing and show them what it's supposed to look like. Show them what it means to have a fully functioning society that where we respect one another, and where we respect the rule of law. And I think that if we all do that, then this generation, this next generation, they're going to surprise us. They're going to get us out of this mess. And that's what I'm putting, that's what I'm putting my money on. So thank you all for joining.
Thanks to Shawn for his fantastic moderating. I sure hope Chris is right that this is, Woodstock in the 1960s rather than Berlin in 1932. But my one wish would be to get this incredibly talented panel and all of you who are involved in our conference today and will be tomorrow together and fund all of us to come up with educational legislative solutions, because this is an incredibly talented group, and I'm really grateful for all of you to be involved in this endeavor with us. So thank you, and let's keep working together on this problem. Thank you so much.